guys, and welcome to this week's video. This week I'll be giving you tips and tricks on how I use a dip pen. A dip pen is one of my favourite mediums to ink with, and I've done it in a fair few videos, and I've had people ask me on tips and tricks on using it. So this dip pen I'm showing you here is a very loved dip pen. I've had this one for a few years now, and out of the few that I've used, this one in particular is my favourite. And this is a Kuretake dip pen, and the tip I'm using here in particular is the Manu tip. If you are interested in looking at these dip pens, I'll leave an Amazon affiliate link down below which has all the nibs that you can possibly use for it. This is a particular favourite within cartoonists, and I was heavily recommended it. The next thing that's really important as well is what ink you use. I have 3 particular brands of ink that I really like to use with dip pens depending on my drawing. So one of them is the Lineart dip pen. This is water resistant and marker resistant, so it's fantastic. I also like to use Winsor & Newton ink as well. Depending on which ink you get, some of them aren't waterproof, but they have a really good colour range. And the other one, which tends to be the little bit more expensive one, is the Artist Acrylic ink, and this is by Dana Rowney. For this piece today, I'll be using the Artist Acrylic ink with this dip pen, but the next thing that's also very important is what paper you use. Now, depending on the paper, ideally you want to avoid using textured paper, because sometimes this can have a bit of trouble with the dip pen. I in particular tend to use mixed media paper that is smooth, so this is the Canson mixed media paper. It has a really smooth surface, so it helps the pen to rest on it really easy. Textured paper sometimes has a weird thing that it does with a dip pen, and sometimes your ink can leave your dip pen in a weird way. So when using a dip pen, it's all about pressure being applied to it. Now this is very simple technique. You press harder when you want thicker lines, and you press lighter when you want thinner lines. It is a bit of a thing that you will have to practice, but as well as this, you kind of want to leave your pen at a slight angle, not quite a 45-degree angle, but leaving your pen at a slight angle helps the ink flow much better. If you're trying to ink straight up, or if you're trying to ink very low down, or using the nib on its side, or using the nib backwards, it can produce interesting techniques, but the ink always flows better when the ink is at the bottom of the pen. This just helps that the ink overall flow better. You will find issues sometimes when you do use dip pens, and that can be the danger of inking in particular with a dip pen. This is of course some very simple tricks are in here, and some very detailed tips will be in here, but I found that when I first used a dip pen, I didn't really know what I was doing, and you can find that you will get issues sometimes when inking. One of my tips is I always keep some tissue next to me so that I can wipe the nib in between layers drying. Obviously, if you apply a layer thickly, it's going to take longer to dry than the layer that you apply thinly. Yet again, this is down to the pressure that you hold the pen down. This can, when you are wiping the nib off, this can really help stop clogging issues, and that can make ink spill all over your page, and that has happened. Or if you press too hard, you can cause the nib to split and cross the nib over, which is going to make it very difficult. Now, as you can see on this nib, this does have a little bit of ink, old ink that's kept on it, and this is because I haven't wiped the nib down properly in between layers. I don't currently have a replacement nib. I am waiting for a few on the way. I wanted them to arrive for this video and they didn't. But I've had this pen and these replacement nibs now. I've had them for I think I've had them for 3 years now. So when you buy them, they do last you quite a while. The only time they won't last you quite a while is if you are pressing very hard on them and causing them to regularly split. This can damage a nib, and obviously then it doesn't work as well anymore. Another danger when it comes to using a dip pen, as I unfortunately happened to me after this piece, is you can get spillage. Just be very, very aware of always where your inkwell is. Maybe keep it in a safe place, because if that ink spills all over your piece, in particular this acrylic ink, if it spills all over your piece, oh, that can damage. I have a very damaged piece of paper next to me right now, which isn't fixable, but hey, that happens, and that can be sometimes the dangers of using traditional medium. Luckily, I was able to rescue most of the line work, but unfortunately, the original is completely toast, and that happens. And that can be the dangers of using a dip pen over using fine liners. So going to actual tips for inking. When you are inking, it's always helpful to think of the flow of an illustration. When you are going to want shadows, you're going to want slightly thicker lines and using hatching to be able to create shading in your piece. This will help when it comes to actually colouring, that some areas are going to be naturally slightly darker than the other. As well, anything that's in the background, you're going to want to use thinner lines towards anything that's in the foreground, anything in particular that you want to pay attention to. It's an old trick that a lot of cartoonists and a lot of manga artists use in order to force perspective for something to be more towards the camera. They'll use thicker lines, and something further away they will use thinner lines. Of course, there are stylistic choices where people want all the line work to be the same, but I particularly do like a mixture of lines. I like thin lines and thicker lines because I think this really helps deal with perspective in an illustration. Now, yet again, this will be down to practice. The more you practice, the better you will get. One of my inking guides, which I do highly recommend, was a manga startup guide that I got when I was much younger, and it's a fantastic book. It can be quite difficult to get a hold of, but it's called How to Pen and Ink, and it says the close-up techniques to the secret techniques of Yasuhiro Naito. I've probably said that completely incorrectly, but I'll leave a link down below. This book gave me all the tips on using inking to really help illustrations sell. As you can see, I'm using lighter lines towards the back, thicker lines towards the front, and helping really push the perspective in this illustration. In the end, it is just a spot illustration with slight details. It isn't overly detailed, but if you're doing a full illustration, I always recommend lighter lines towards the back and thicker lines towards the front. When you're thinking about flow of an illustration as well, particularly when it comes to hair or lines in clothing, you're going to want both thicker and thinner lines to really help sell the flow. And what I mean by this is where the fold is going to be the strongest. You're going to want thicker lines and shading in those folds, and thinner lines in between clothes folding, because yet again, when it comes to colouring, that is going to sell a lot of the folding. But if you're doing extreme folding, there are some fantastic tutorials, some fantastic illustrations available online, and I always recommend drawing from life and understanding from life as well. I know a lot of people don't like using line art or find line art a bit too harsh, but I personally find line art really enjoyable to do. I find it extremely relaxing. So here you can see that the background, my foreground areas here is slightly blending with my background. And the way to combat this is you can go back over with your dip pen and create thicker areas. It's always better to start lighter and then to go thicker with a dip pen, as it is with any inking technique. You're going to want to apply thicker lines in certain areas afterwards, and once you've applied thick lines, it's very difficult to go back. So if you are very nervous, I will suggest probably getting a few test pieces, try it on bits of paper, understanding the flow. There are dip pens which behave very differently, like for example glass dip pens. They do behave slightly differently because they aren't down to pressure, whereas these dip pens that I use currently in this video, or this dip pen that I use, is down to pressure, so it will you'll be able to get a line variation that way. So just to show you here what I mean by pressing down, as you can see right now I'm pressing down slightly harder. This causes the dip pen to slightly open up to allow the ink to flow heavier, and then if you wanted to do slightly lighter lines, you don't have to press hard at all. So it's just about gauging that technique. So you can see here, I'm pressing harder, causing that ink well to open up and let through more ink, and then lighter, and then it just helps that ink flow a little bit better. Yet again, through everything that you will try is through practice, trial and error. If you're ever unsure about using a dip pen, there is hundreds of techniques and hundreds of videos available online which will show you more advanced techniques. Think of this as tips for people who've never really tried using a dip pen before. I love inking, and it's one of my favorite things to do with illustration, and it's one of my overall favorite things, and I can't get enough of it. I hope this video has been somewhat helpful to get you guys. Let me know if you're interested in other inking tips and tricks. I was thinking I might do a fine liner one as well. When it comes to lining, there is a lot of techniques that can be applied across all different inking mediums, and I really do enjoy different ways that you can ink. I hope you also like this illustration, and let me know if this video has been somewhat helpful. As always, if you want to, comment down below what's your favourite inking medium, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and as always, stay creative.